Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Heights United Methodist Church. I'm Kent Little, Senior Pastor. Actually, I guess I should welcome you to our home. We are home this morning. We decided to cancel our activities at the church today because of the snow. I'm not sure how much snow we got. I would guess maybe 5 or 6 inches at least. Anyway, so it's a little treacherous out there, so I hope you are home and safe and warm. So I thought, since we weren't meeting in person, maybe I would just do kind of a Cliff's Notes version, perhaps, of my sermon that I had prepared for this morning. For those of you who have access, either live, if you're joining me live, or if you see this video at a later time. So anyway, it is a beautiful snow. I have for a long time been a snow guy. I enjoy snow, and this one is some of my favorite when it's there's not a lot of wind, so there's not a lot of drifting, and so it's level, and it's beautiful outside. And I think it, especially early in the morning, before there's too much activity, a blanket of snow like this just quiets everything and kind of muffles the sounds. Anyway, I just think it's peaceful and a beautiful piece of nature that we exist in. Now, I will confess, as it melts and freezes, sometimes that gets a little treacherous and hard to get around in as well. But anyway, so I'm grateful for the snow. I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving weekend, recognizing that they are days filled with gratitude and thanks and joy, and they can also be filled with sorrow and missing loved ones that are no longer with us, especially if this was your first Thanksgiving with a loved one who was gone. That can be a difficult time. So anyway, I need to recognize that too and know you are in my prayers. So this morning I was going to deal with the parable of the talents. Hopefully at least some of you are familiar with that parable. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. If you remember the story, and I guess I should set this up a little bit. A talent, if you're not familiar with that, a talent was a form of currency in Jesus' day. And so the story that Jesus tells, the parable Jesus tells, is that a man, an owner, landowner, a wealthy man, was getting ready to leave for a time. And so he called his servants together, 3 of his servants together, and he gave each one of them a certain amount, a number of talents to keep for him. And to the first he gave, and I'm doing this from memory, so I can't remember exactly how many, but the first he gave the most amount of talents, and the second one he gave a smaller amount, and the third he gave the smallest amount. And so anyway, the owner left on vacation or wherever he was going, and when he came back, he called the servants together, and the first servant came and said, I invested your monies, and I increased them by a significant amount. And the owner was glad and happy and gave him even more responsibility. And the second came to the owner, and he too invested the money while while the owner was gone. So he also increased the amount, and the owner was happy and gave him even more responsibility. And the third servant came and said he was afraid of his owner, that he knew his owner was mean, was not a nice guy. This is my paraphrase. Was not a nice guy, that he reaped where he did not sow, and so he was fearful, and so he dug a hole in the ground and buried the talents and said, "So here is the money you entrusted me with." Though he didn't make any additional, he returned what he had been given, and the owner was angry. Sent the servant off, and anyway, so the typical interpretation of this story is maybe even preached around stewardship time. We need to be good stewards of money, invest it well, grow our resources so we can do ministry or whatever. Anyway, so and the last servant is an example of what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't be fearful. We shouldn't hide our gifts, our resources in a hole in the ground, so to speak. So that's kind of the typical, or at least that's what I always heard the interpretation of this story as, which is it's a good interpretation of the story. Certainly carries with it a good message. Well, several years ago, I think it was the last time I preached on this parable. I decided to try to take it a different direction. And as is usual, when I think I have an original thought, I find out I didn't have an original thought. So anyway, I did preach this sermon from an alternative point of view. And then here in the last couple of years, I've run across at least 2 or 3 commentators on this passage who also have taken this alternative point of view, very similar to the one that I did. And so I didn't have an original thought. Somebody had already thought about it before me, which doesn't surprise me at all. But anyway, the last one I read was Dinah Butler Bass. She's an author, theologian, that I read her commentaries each week as I prepare my sermon. And she talked about the majority and the minority view of this parable. She said the majority view is around stewardship, that we should invest our resources, that the first 2 servants did what they were supposed to with the talents they were given, and that the 3rd servant did not, and he was fearful, and so he hid his talents, the gifts that he had been given, and didn't increase them. It's a legitimate interpretation. And then she talks about the minority view, which is what I had preached on this several years ago. And the minority view is that the 3rd servant was right. We can see in the story that the owner was not particularly a nice guy. Certainly didn't offer grace or forgiveness to the 3rd servant. He didn't deny. In fact, he said, "So I reap where I do not sow. So you thought I was an angry man." And basically the owner said, "Well, let me show you just how mean I could be." And so anyway, so in some sense, the 3rd servant was right in his perception of who his owner was. And so perhaps he had good reason to be fearful. And so he did not invest the monies to grow them. And the minority view is that this 3rd servant took a stand and basically said, "No, I'm not going to participate in your injustice. I'm not going to participate in you reaping where you do not sow. I'm not going to participate in you using your money to hurt people, you using your influence and your power to hurt people. And so I didn't invest your money. And here's what you gave me." and that's all. And and this is me interpreting. And so the third servant is basically saying, so you're getting what you deserve, your money back. That I'm not participating in your injustice. And so anyway, I think that's an excellent interpretation of this parable as well, though it might be considered a minority view. But it certainly, I think, fits with the social gospel and the compassion and justice that Jesus exemplified in his ministry and his time with us. And so I think this would be a very good way to think, well, perhaps Jesus wasn't necessarily talking about investing and not being fearful, etc., but rather how did the first two servants participate in the owner's acts of injustice, in the owner's acts of greed, perhaps, in the owner's acts of reaping where he did not sow, and harming people in the process. And the third servant taking a stand and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. So I think the lesson for us today, as we think about that parable, is for us to take seriously that minority view, if that's what we want to call it, and ask ourselves, how do we participate in our particular culture and society? How do we participate in the economics of our world, and the economics of our community, and the economics of our church, and in our own individual economics? How do we participate in that economic structure? Do we, through our investments, through the use of our money, the use of our time and talents, the use of our gifts and resources, do we somehow participate in injustice, knowingly or unknowingly? Or are we awake enough? Are we mindful enough to try to pay attention to where our money is being used, where our time is being used, that we don't participate in the injustice that our economic system can often foster? So yeah, I think for me that's a good lesson out of this parable as well. And I confess, it's hard to know. It's hard to know to some degree how we spend our money, how we save our money, how we invest our money, how we invest our time, how we utilize our own gifts, our own talents, our own resources in a way that doesn't harm others. And I think we can be conscious of that and do our best to make sure that doesn't happen. But like I say, sometimes it's difficult to know, especially in our economic structures. But to try to be mindful, to try to pay attention to where things are manufactured, to how things are manufactured. Some of the things we buy, can we find out? Are we supporting sweatshops, not only in the U.S. but around the world, where people are paid poverty wages to produce millions and billions for corporations? How do we do research to try to combat that as followers of the way of Jesus? It's not always an easy task, but I do believe it's part of our calling as we imitate, as we reflect the light of Christ in our world around us. So I think that's a fitting message, perhaps right after Thanksgiving, just going through Black Friday, so to speak, this last Friday, and in preparation for Christmas. Are there ways we can be conscious of how we share the gift of Christmas, how we exchange gifts, how we do our shopping, where we buy, who we buy from, how we give, etc., and be mindful to try the best we can not to participate in ways that does harm, economically, physically, etc., to others. I think it's a good reflection for this last Sunday before we venture into Advent. So anyway, thanks for joining me this morning. Whether you're here live or whether you find this on our Facebook page later. Next week we'll start Advent, and I think I've mentioned before through Advent and Christmas Eve, all of the themes of Sundays are going to revolve around Mary's Magnificat, which will kind of continue this theme in some ways of what we've talked about this morning in terms of how we see and think and know and trust and have faith God works in the world, and what it was the message of the Christ child brings to us on Christmas morning. So thank you for being with me this morning. Like I said, I hope you're staying home, safe and warm. Take time this day to rest and to take care of yourself and your family. Hope to see you next week. I'll be back Wednesday for my midweek musing, but then I hope to see you next Sunday morning for our first Sunday of Advent. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a great and gratitude-filled day. And as I always share, as we move into, especially I think this Christmas season, but always, seek peace and be a light and love one another, every single other, until there are no others, only one beloved community of all. May it be so. May it be so. Goodbye and God bless.